twin orc warriors test a lowly human, he must win their deadly challenge. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in the space between two armies. Not the silence of an empty field, not the silence of a sleeping village. This is something heavier, the silence of 10,000 people holding their breath at the same time, waiting to see if the world is about to end. That was the silence Soren walked into. He stepped out of the human line alone, without armor, without a horse, without a banner. Just a man in a worn leather vest and travel-stained trousers, a short blade at his hip that he had no intention of drawing. He walked across the sand with the careful, measured steps of someone who understood that the wrong movement, even a stumble, even a sneeze, could start a war that would swallow thousands of lives before the sun went down. The desert between the two armies was enormous and merciless. The sand was the color of old bone, and the heat rising from it distorted the air so that the distant orc warband seemed to shimmer like a fever dream. Soren could feel the sun pressing down on the back of his neck like a hand trying to push him into the earth. He kept walking. Behind him, he could feel the eyes of every human soldier burning into his back. He could hear, just barely, the voice of Captain Dreve screaming at him to come back, that this was suicide, that no one had authorized this, that he was going to get himself killed and drag them all into a slaughter. Soren did not look back. Looking back would have been easier. Looking back would have meant he still believed there was a way out that didn't involve crossing this sand. There wasn't. He knew what was waiting for him at the orc line. Everyone did. The stories about the twin warriors of the Dusk Sand Horde had reached every tavern, every barracks, every frightened village between here and the eastern coast. Two orc women, identical as reflections in dark water, who had never lost a battle, never lost a duel, never once shown mercy to an enemy who did not deserve it. The kind of warriors that empires built their nightmares around. He kept walking anyway. At roughly the halfway point between the two armies, close enough to the orc line now that he could see individual faces, could make out the glint of axe blades in the harsh afternoon light. He stopped. He did what the old protocols demanded. He knelt on one knee. He pressed his palms together in front of his chest. He bowed his head, and then he waited. The sand was hot enough to burn through the knee of his trousers. He barely noticed. He was too busy listening for the sound of something large moving toward him and trying to remember how to breathe correctly when every instinct he had was screaming at him to run. He heard them before he saw them. Not footsteps. The sand swallowed footsteps. What he heard was the sound of two sets of armor moving in perfect synchronization. The slight jingle of chainmail, the creak of leather straps, the particular rhythm of two people who had trained together so long that their bodies had stopped being separate things and become one motion split between two frames. He kept his head down. "Look up, human!" The voice was low, flat, and carried the particular weight of someone who had never once in their life needed to raise it to be heard. Soren looked up. There were two of them, standing close enough that he could have reached out and touched either one without fully extending his arm. They were not what he had expected, which was its own kind of shock. He had expected enormous. He had expected monstrous. He had expected the kind of physical presence that makes a man feel like a child. What he had not expected was how similar they looked to something almost human, and how much more unsettling that was than if they had looked completely alien. Vara stood on the left. Her skin was the deep, rich green of forest moss in shadow, darker across her shoulders and forearms where old scars had healed thick and slightly raised, like tree roots pushing through the surface of the earth. Her hair was black and long, pulled back with a strip of dark leather. Her tusks, the two lower ones that curved up past her lips, were slightly asymmetrical, the left one fractionally longer than the right, the tip worn smooth in a way that suggested she had run her tongue across it 10,000 times while thinking. Her armor was good iron, not ceremonial, practical, dented in places, repaired in others. The eyes she fixed on Soren were the dark amber of old honey, and they were doing what eyes like that always do, measuring. Zeth stood on the right, same height, same architecture of face and bone. But where Vara's Pele was forest deep, Zeth's was the lighter green olive of sun-touched leaves, and where Vara's eyes were amber, Zeth's were the sharp, vivid yellow of a wolf looking at something it hasn't decided yet whether to eat. Her hair was short, cut close to her skull on the sides, and slightly longer on top, which made her jaw look wider, her tusks more prominent. She was smiling. That was the thing Soren noticed most. Vara was watching him with the careful attention of someone gathering information. Zeth was smiling at him the way a cat smiles at a mouse. Not because she was happy, but because she found the situation entertaining in a way that boded poorly for the mouse. Neither of them was the towering, massive creature the stories had described. They were tall, taller than Soren, taller than most humans he had known, but not the mythic giants of the campfire stories. They were built the way elite warriors are built, every muscle earned through specific work, nothing wasted, nothing decorative, the kind of bodies that had been trained for years to end conflicts as efficiently as possible. Soren kept his hands pressed together and his voice steady. "My name is Soren. I come from the village of Ashwick, 17 miles north by northeast of this position. I am not a soldier. I am not a negotiator. I do not have the authority of any lord, any king, or any military commander." He paused. "I have come to ask for passage." Silence. Then Zeth laughed. It was a short, genuine sound, not cruel, which somehow made it worse. The laugh of someone who has just heard something that genuinely surprised her with its audacity. "Passage," she repeated. The word in her mouth sounded like she was turning it over, examining it from all sides. The human walked across the death field alone to ask for passage. "Yes," Soren said. "You understand?" Vara said, and her voice had the quality of stone speaking, "that we have been given orders to hold this ground, that your army stands between us and the eastern trade routes, that this is not a conversation we were expecting to have today." "I know," Soren said. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." This time even Vara's expression shifted, just slightly, just at the corners of her eyes. Not amusement exactly, something more like recalibration. "What is in Ashwick," she said, "that is worth your life?" Soren's right hand moved to his pocket, a quick involuntary gesture, the way your hand goes to something you need before you even consciously decide to reach for it. His fingers found the edge of the folded linen handkerchief, small and worn smooth, and he stopped himself before he pulled it out. "My sister," he said. "She's 19. The village has been cut off from supply routes for 3 months. What they had stored has run out. If the army stay here another 2 weeks, she dies. Most of them die." He looked directly at Vara, because instinct told him she was the one who mattered, the one whose judgment would carry weight. "I am not asking you to move your army. I am not asking you to end the standoff. I am asking for a humanitarian corridor, a single road, guarded with restrictions you define, to allow supply wagons to reach Ashwick and civilians to leave if they choose." Vara looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at her sister. Something passed between them. Not words, not even expressions precisely, but the particular communication of two people who have spent every day of their lives in each other's presence and have developed a language below language. Zeth's smile faded. In its place came something more considered. "You understand," Zeth said, "that we don't make these kinds of decisions for small men with sad stories." "I understand. And you understand that the reason you're still breathing right now is because walking out here alone was either the bravest thing we've seen in 3 campaigns or the stupidest, and we haven't decided which yet." "I've been told it's usually both," Soren said. Zeth looked at Vara again. Vara looked at Soren for what felt like a very long time. The desert wind moved between them, carrying grit and heat and the distant smell of cook fires from both camps. Behind the orc line, Soren could see figures watching, hundreds of warriors, still as carved stone, waiting. "There is a way," Vara said finally, "that this conversation could continue." Soren felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, too early for relief, but possibility. "Tell me." "Our people have a tradition," she said. When an outsider makes a claim on our honor, when they ask for something that can only be given through respect, they must earn the right to be heard, not through strength. We are not interested in your strength." The look she gave him made clear that she had already assessed and filed away his physical capabilities, and they did not warrant further discussion. Through something rarer. "What's the tradition called?" Soren asked. "The Tharakvol," Duvok said. Soren hadn't noticed the old orc approach. He was suddenly simply there, standing slightly behind and between the twins, as though he had always been there and Soren had simply failed to register him. He was the largest of the three, though age had redistributed his mass in the way it does with old warriors. The explosive muscle of his prime years had settled into something denser, more architectural. His skin was the dark green-grey of stone in deep shadow. His face was a map of old decisions. His right hand, which he held casually at his side, had only 3 fingers, the ring and little finger gone at the second knuckle, the stumps healed smooth and pale as old ivory. He looked at Soren the way very old people sometimes look at the young, not unkindly, but with the particular patience of someone who has watched many things begin and end, and is no longer surprised by either. "The Tharakvol," Duvok repeated, as if the word itself deserved to be said twice. 3 tests, not of your body, of what lives inside it." He tapped his own chest with one of his remaining fingers. "If you pass all 3, your request is granted. The twins give their word, and the word of Vara and Zeth is worth more than any treaty your lords have ever signed." He paused. "If you fail any one of the 3 tests, we take you back to our camp. You remain there until the armies reach a resolution. However long that takes. And the tests are, you'll know them when they come," Duvok said. "That's the first part of the Tharakvol. You don't prepare, you simply are." Soren looked at the old orc. He looked at Vara, whose expression had settled into something that was neither encouragement nor warning. He looked at Zeth, who had stopped smiling and was watching him with her wolf-yellow eyes in a way that felt more serious than any expression she'd worn before. His hand found the handkerchief again in his pocket. The fabric was thin as old promises. He thought of Neve, dark-haired, stubborn, terrible at asking for help, who had pressed this into his palm at the village gate and said only, "Come back." "All right," Soren said. "I accept." The first test came without announcement. They brought him into the orc camp, walking him through the warband, which parted around him in silence, the way water parts around something that doesn't belong. Soren kept his eyes forward and his face neutral and tried not to think too hard about the number of armed warriors whose personal space he was moving through. He counted the steps instead. He had always done that when afraid, counted things. It gave his mind something to do other than catalogue the ways the situation could go wrong. The camp was nothing like the disorganized, brutal collection of tents the stories described. It was ordered, methodical. There was a logic to how the sections were arranged. Forges and armories on the eastern edge, where the wind carried sparks away from the sleeping areas. Kitchens centrally located. Command tents elevated on packed earth. The cook fires burned even and controlled, not the wild bonfires of the stories. The warriors who weren't on the line were eating, sharpening blades, talking in the low guttural rhythms of the orc tongue. Children. And there were children which Soren had not expected, which stopped something in his chest, ran between the tents with the absolute focus that children bring to whatever game they're playing, entirely uninterested in the human walking through their camp. Targa was the one who appeared to his left without being summoned. She was the tallest orc woman Soren had seen, nearly 2 meters, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been in more than a few serious conversations with other people's weapons. She said nothing to him. She simply walked alongside him at the pace the twins set, her dark green eyes moving across the camp with the practiced scan of someone whose job was to notice things before they became problems. She didn't look hostile. She looked like someone doing math she didn't entirely like the answer to. They stopped at the edge of a cleared space, sand raked smooth, a rough circle perhaps 15 paces across. In the center of the circle stood a single orc warrior, young, perhaps 20, built with the compact density of someone who had trained every day since he could walk. He was not wearing full armor, neither was he unarmed. He carried a wooden practice blade, thick and heavy, the kind that didn't draw blood, but left bruises that taught lessons. Szeth stood at the edge of the circle. "First test," she said. "The test of truth." Soren looked at her. "I need to fight him." "No." She said it with a slight emphasis that suggested she found the assumption mildly offensive. "You need to beat him. There's a difference. He will give you 3 attacks, 3 only. You don't need to hurt him. You don't need to match his strength." The wolf-yellow eyes fixed on Soren with something approaching genuine interest. "You need to find the one way to stop him that doesn't involve pretending you're something you're not." Soren looked at the young warrior. The young warrior looked back with the expression of someone who had already decided this would be quick. "What's the point of the test?" Soren asked. "Humans lie about what they are," Vara said from behind him. He hadn't heard her move. "They pretend to be stronger than they are, braver than they are, more capable, less afraid. Our people have no use for what you pretend to be. We want to know what you actually are." She paused. "The test is whether you can win without lying, to us or to yourself." Soren stood at the edge of the circle. He took off his vest, folded it once, set it on the ground. He drew his short blade and held it loosely at his side, not in a fighting stance, just held it the way you hold a tool before you know what you're going to build. He looked at the young warrior and thought about what he actually was. He was not a fighter. He had been a soldier, briefly, in his early 20s, but he had been a bad soldier, which was why he had eventually left. He was not fast. He was not particularly strong. He had a scar on his chin from a fall off a market cart at age 15, and another on his left knee from a poorly handled hunting accident. He was 31 days away from his 29th birthday. He had not slept properly in 6 days. He was currently standing in the middle of an orc warband in a desert with no backup and a pocket handkerchief as his primary emotional support. What he was someone who had spent 8 years as a courier, crossing difficult terrain through hostile territories in conditions that killed other people, by being very, very good at reading situations and very, very fast at deciding which part of a situation to not engage with. The young warrior moved. He was fast. Genuinely fast, the kind of fast that comes from years of drilling specific movements until the body stops thinking and just executes. The wooden blade came in high, angled across, aimed at Soren's shoulder. Soren stepped left instead of back. He moved closer, not away, which was not what the young warrior expected. The body expects retreat. It plans for retreat, and when retreat doesn't come, the plan has to be rebuilt in real time. In the half-second that rebuilding took, Soren got his forearm behind the warrior's striking arm, redirected the arc of the blow past his own ear, and simultaneously stepped into the space the warrior's body had just vacated. He put his blade, flat, not edge, against the back of the warrior's neck. 1 second, maybe less. The circle was completely silent. The young warrior froze. Then slowly, he turned his head to look at Soren with an expression that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite respect, and was somehow both. Soren stepped back and lowered his blade. He looked at Szeth. He looked at Vara. He said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Szeth looked at her sister. That below-language communication happened again. This time Soren thought he caught the edge of it. Not words, but something like, "Well, 2 more tests," Vara said. The second test came that evening, after the sun had dropped behind the desert ridgeline and the camp had shifted into its nighttime configuration. Fires lower, voices quieter, the particular settling sound of a large group of people moving from active to rest. They brought Soren to the command tent and gave him food. He ate it carefully, aware that refusing would be an insult, and that eating too fast would suggest he hadn't had enough. Orc camp food was exactly what he'd expected. Dense, heavily seasoned, with something bitter and aromatic that he didn't recognize. The meat cooked past what humans would consider done. He ate every bite. He did not make a face. This was not courage. This was the simple pragmatism of someone who had eaten worse. Zeth sat across the fire from him, cross-legged, watching him eat with the evaluative attention she seemed to give everything. "Your sister," she said. "Tell me about her." Soren looked up. "Is this the second test?" "Everything is the second test," Zeth said. "Or nothing is. Decide which answer scares you more and work backward from there." He set down the bowl. He thought about Neve, about how she looked when she was annoyed, which was most of the time, about the way she talked with her hands when she was excited about something, about the terrible embroidery she had done on the handkerchief currently sitting in his pocket, the waves all slightly uneven, the thread already fraying at the edges when she gave it to him because she had never been patient. Enough to do anything slowly. He pulled the handkerchief out. He set it on the ground between them. Zeth looked at it. The fabric was pale in the firelight, off-white linen, the blue thread of the wave pattern gone almost grey with age and handling. It was clearly someone's handmade attempt at a gift, and just as clearly the work of someone who was better at giving gifts than making them. "She's stubborn," Soren said. "She makes decisions about things before she has enough information and then refuses to update them, which is an exhausting quality in a person and also probably the thing that's kept her alive this long." He paused. "She made that when she was 12. She decided she was going to embroider something for me, and she did not let the fact that she didn't know how to embroider slow her down at all. She just started doing it and finished it and gave it to me and told me it was perfect." He looked at the handkerchief. "I told her it was perfect too." Zeth looked at him. The wolf-yellow eyes were not hard right now. They were something else. Still measuring, but measuring something different than before. "Why?" she asked. "Because she was 12, Soren said, "and because it was perfect. Just not in the way she thought." Zeth reached out and picked up the handkerchief. She held it in her hand, which was larger than Soren's by a significant margin, the fingers thick and calloused, the knuckles heavy, and turned it over once, studying the uneven waves and the fraying thread. Something moved across her face, gone too fast to name, but real. She set it back down carefully, smoothed one corner with her thumb, and pushed it back towards Soren. "Why are you the one who came?" she asked. "Not a soldier, not a diplomat. Why you?" "Because no one else was going to," he said. "That's not an answer. That's an observation. It's both." He picked up the handkerchief, folded it the way he always folded it, 3 times, the waves facing inward, and put it back in his pocket. "There are people in Ashwick who are braver than me. There are people who are stronger and better trained and more qualified to stand in front of a warband and negotiate. None of them walked across the sand today." He met her eyes. "I did. That's the only answer I have." Zeth was quiet for a while. The fire crackled between them, and the camp sounds moved around them in their nighttime rhythms. "You're afraid," she said finally. Not an accusation. An observation with no judgment attached to it. "Yes. You've been afraid since you left the human line." "Since before that," Soren said. "Since I decided to do this. And you still came?" "Yes." Zeth looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Short, definitive, the kind of nod that closes a subject. Vara appeared at the tent entrance. She looked at her sister first, then at Soren. Something passed between the twins, that wordless exchange, and Vara's expression shifted by a fraction. "Tomorrow," Vara said. "The third test at dawn." Soren slept on the ground outside the command tent. Targa sat nearby, not quite guarding him, not quite ignoring him. At some point in the night, Soren was not quite asleep, but not quite awake. She spoke. "The first human who tried the Tharak Vol," she said, into the darkness, as if she was talking to the air and he happened to be in the way, "ran on the second test. We never found out what he ran from, just looked at Vara and ran." A pause. "The second one made it through all 3. He is a trade partner of the Horde now, has been for 11 years. Soren didn't respond. I'm telling you this, Targa said, not because you asked, you didn't. I'm telling you because you should know the Tharek Vol has produced one outcome other than failure. One. Another pause, longer. I don't know what the third test will be, but I know what it will ask. What will it ask? Soren said. Whether you understand the difference, she said, between courage and stubbornness. She said nothing more after that. Eventually, the camp sounds faded further, and the desert night settled into its cold, clear dark, and Soren lay on his back, looking at more stars than he had ever seen from inside a city, and thought about the difference between courage and stubbornness, and whether he had ever truly known which one he was operating on. Dawn came without ceremony. The desert made no distinction between night and morning. The darkness simply began retreating across the sand until the sky in the east went from black to deep purple to a flat, burning orange that promised another day of merciless heat. Vara came for him before the camp had fully woken. She was already in armor. She always seemed to be already in armor, Soren thought, as though she had simply been born wearing it. She led him to the eastern edge of the camp, past the armory fires that were already beginning to rouse for the day's work, past the cook stations where the smell of roasting grain and something spiced was just beginning to drift through the cold morning air. They stopped at a place where the camp ended and the open desert began, a kind of threshold defined by nothing more than the absence of tents and the presence of unbroken sand stretching toward the ridge. Szeth was already there, standing, waiting. Her expression was the most serious Soren had seen it, not the sharp amusement of yesterday, not the evaluative quiet of the firelight conversation. Something settled, something that had been decided. Tuvok was there too, standing slightly apart, his three-fingered hand resting at his side. Soren stopped and waited. The third test, Vara said, is not a test you take. She looked at him steadily. It's a test you make a choice about. Tell me, Soren said. Szeth turned to look at the ridge. 3 days ago, she said, our scouts found something on the eastern approach, a small group of civilians. Ashwick civilians. They were attempting to move along the ridge road, trying to get to the supply junction on the far side before the armies sealed it completely. She paused. They didn't make it. They're currently sheltering in the ruins of the old way station at the foot of the northern ridge. 3 kilometers from here. 4 adults, 2 children. They have no food. They have very little water. The canyon road behind them is controlled by a third party, a bandit company that moves into the gaps between armies, and they cannot go back without protection. Soren felt the information land in him the way heavy things land. Not a shock. He had known things were bad in Ashwick, had known people were trying to flee. But hearing it specified, 4 adults, 2 children, 3 kilometers, no food, made it solid and heavy in a way that abstract knowing didn't. The test, Vara said, is this. We can send a detachment to bring them safely to neutral ground. Free of charge, no conditions. She held his gaze. Or you can go yourself now, alone, and bring them back. If you go, you risk the bandits, you risk the terrain, you risk the possibility of not coming back. Soren looked at her. What's the test? Why would the test be whether I go alone when you're offering to do it for free? Because, Tuvok said from his position slightly apart, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who has said things like this before and knows the moment they land. The test is not whether you go. The test is whether you can accept help. Soren stopped. Humans who come to us, Tuvok said, do so in one of 2 ways. They come with the arrogance of those who believe they are doing us a favor by not killing us, or they come with the pride of those who would rather die trying alone than accept that they might need what we can offer. He tilted his head slightly. Both are forms of the same thing. Both say, I cannot allow myself to be in your debt. Both say, I would rather fail on my own than succeed beside you. He turned his 3-fingered hand over, palm up, in a gesture that was somehow both simple and enormously dignified. The Tharek Vol is 3 tests. The first asks, do you know what you are? The second asks, do you know what matters to you? The third asks, Can you put those two things together and accept that sometimes the bravest thing is to say yes when someone offers to help? The desert held its silence around them. Soren stood very still. He looked at Vara, he looked at Zeth, he looked at Duvok's open hand. He thought about Neve, about the handkerchief in his pocket, about the 19 years she had spent waiting for him to come home from one thing or another, and the particular stubbornness with which she had never once stopped expecting him to come back. He thought about crossing the sand yesterday, the weight of all those eyes, the sound of his own heartbeat, the counting of steps. He thought about every moment in his life when he had done something hard and alone and called it courage, when maybe sometimes it had been something closer to pride, wearing courage's clothes. He thought about 4 adults and 2 children in a way station 3 kilometers away, with no food and no water and bandits on the road behind them. He let out a breath. "Send the detachment," he said. "Please." Vara looked at him for a long time. Her dark amber eyes were unreadable in the way deep water is unreadable. You know there's something under the surface, but the light doesn't go far enough to show you what. Then she nodded. It was Zeth who moved first. She turned to 2 warriors nearby and gave orders in the Orc tongue. Quick, precise, the language used for operational instructions, no room for ambiguity. The warriors moved. Within 3 minutes, a detachment of 8 had assembled and was heading east toward the ridge at the kind of measured pace that covers ground efficiently without wearing out legs you might need later. Targa was among them. She didn't look at Soren as she passed, but her pace slowed by the smallest fraction when she drew level with him, just enough that it might have been a nod translated into movement. Soren stood and watched them go. He became aware that Vara was standing beside him. She was close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. Orc body temperature ran higher than human, something he hadn't known until this moment when the warmth was right there, tangible, oddly like standing near a low fire. The second person to complete the Tharakvol, Vara said quietly, stood in this same place. He also chose to accept the help. She paused. He cried afterward. He thought we would see it as weakness. Another pause, longer. We didn't. Soren looked at her. What did you see it as? Honesty, she said, which is rarer than strength and harder to fake. It took the detachment 4 hours to reach the way station, negotiate with the bandit company's outer scouts, who, faced with 8 armed Orc warriors in a position of obvious tactical advantage, decided that principle was a luxury they couldn't afford on a mercenary salary, and returned to camp with the 6 civilians. They were thin, they were exhausted. They had the particular hollow-eyed look of people who have been afraid for longer than fear is supposed to last. 2 of the adults were an older couple, grey-haired, holding each other's arms. One was a young woman, barely older than Neve, with a child on her hip. The last adult was a man about Soren's age, who had clearly been trying to hold everyone together through sheer force of anxious competence and was very close to the end of his resources. The 2 children, a girl of perhaps 7 and a boy of maybe 5, were still capable of running, which children somehow always are, and they immediately began investigating the camp, with the complete lack of self-preservation instinct that is one of childhood's few genuine gifts. The Orc who ran the camp kitchen, a wide, scarred man whose forearms were extraordinary and who communicated primarily through the medium of giving people food, began producing portions without being asked. He did it with the exact same bored efficiency with which he presumably fed warriors twice a day, 7 days a week, as if feeding frightened human civilians was simply a normal variation on the usual work. Soren watched a small human girl accept a bowl of Orc camp food from hands 3 times the size of her head and drink it without hesitation, and felt something move through him that he didn't have a name for. Something between gratitude and grief, and something else that was neither. He pulled the handkerchief from his pocket. He looked at it. The uneven waves, the fraying thread, the fabric worn thin where he had folded and unfolded it 10,000 times across 8 years. Vara was watching him. He hadn't heard her approach. He was beginning to think approaching without being heard was simply something she did, the way certain people have the quality of appearing in rooms they weren't in before. "You said your sister is 19, Vara said. "Yes. How old were you when you started carrying that?" Soren looked at the handkerchief. 21. She made it when she was 12. She gave it to me just before I left for the first time I left. He folded it, unfolded it. I've left 7 times since then. She gives it back to me every time. Vara was quiet for a moment. "Zeth and I had a brother," she said. The past tense arrived without ceremony, without softening. Just had. He was younger, not by much. 3 years. He was different from us. Not a warrior. He had a kind of... She paused, as if the word she wanted was in a language she didn't speak natively. A kind of softness, not weakness, just softness. He felt things more than most orcs allow themselves to. She looked at the camp around them, at the orderly rows of tents, at the cook fires, at the children who had forgotten to be afraid and were now engaged in some kind of running game with 2 young orc warriors who had been assigned to watch them and were visibly uncertain about the assignment. He died 4 years ago. Fever. Not in battle. Just fever. She said it without flinching, because she was the kind of person who had long ago passed through the place where flinching was possible and come out the other side. "We keep his fire burning. In the command tent. It's not for ceremony. It's not for religion. It's just, we keep it burning." Soren looked at her. He understood that she was not asking for anything. She was not looking for sympathy or acknowledgement. She was simply giving him something, in the way that someone who has seen you show them something real decides to show you something real in return. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just understand that softness is not something we mistake for weakness. Not here. Not anymore." She looked at the handkerchief in his hands. He held it out to her without planning to, without knowing he was going to until the gesture was already made. "You should, if you want." She took it, held it in her large, calloused palm, turned it over once, looking at the uneven waves. Then she folded it, not the same way he folded it, but with a similar care, the kind of care that comes from understanding that something is meaningful, even if you don't fully know its meaning, and held it back out to him. He took it, put it back in his pocket. The treaty negotiation happened in the afternoon. Vara and Zeth, with 2 of their senior officers on one side, a hastily assembled delegation from the human camp who arrived looking baffled and underprepared and were clearly working very hard not to show it, on the other, with Soren sitting at the edge of it as a kind of living evidence that the conversation was possible. Luvok sat slightly apart and said almost nothing, which Soren was beginning to understand meant he was paying attention to everything. The humanitarian corridor was agreed upon within the first hour. The broader standoff resolution took longer and remained incomplete when the sun went down, but the framework was there. The shape of the thing, the outline of what could become an agreement if the people on both sides chose to follow through. Soren sat through all of it and said nothing unless directly asked, which was twice. Both times he said exactly what was true and nothing more. When it was over, when the human delegation had returned to their camp and the orc officers had dispersed to their duties, Vara came to stand beside him one last time. The camp was moving into its evening rhythm around them. Cook fires rising, the low, rolling sound of orc voices in conversation. Somewhere in the center of the camp, someone was playing a drum, not a war drum, something smaller, a practiced, repetitive rhythm that was more like thinking out loud than music. "You're free to go," Vara said. "The corridor will be open by tomorrow morning. Supply wagons can reach Ashwick within 2 days, if they move now. The civilians we collected today will be transferred to neutral ground at dawn." Soren nodded. "Thank you." She looked at him. The amber eyes, the slight asymmetry of her tusks, the old scars on her arms in the fading light. She was going to say something else. He could see it forming. And then she didn't. And then she did. "The human who completed the Thorakval 11 years ago," she said. He comes back sometimes, not on business, just comes, brings food sometimes, sits with Duvok, plays badly at a bone game Zeth tries to teach him every visit and fails to learn every time. A pause. He said once that the Tharakvol was the first time in his life he had ever been tested on who he actually was, rather than who he was supposed to be. She looked at the desert, at the ridge darkening against the evening sky. He said it was the most frightening thing that had ever happened to him. I believe him, Soren said. She almost smiled. He saw it, the very edge of it, just at the corner of her mouth, lasting perhaps half a second before it was gone. Your sister made that thing when she was 12, she said, nodding at his pocket. With bad thread and worse technique. She paused. Go home to her. He walked back across the desert in the last of the light. The sand had cooled, and his footsteps made soft sounds in it, and the sky above him went from orange to violet to the deep blue that lives just before full dark. Behind him the orc camp glowed with firelight. Ahead of him the human camp glowed with firelight. Between them, him, alone, walking. He reached into his pocket. His fingers found the handkerchief, the thin fabric, the fraying thread, the uneven waves Neve had embroidered when she was 12 years old and hadn't known how to embroider and had done it anyway. He counted his steps the rest of the way home. Captain Dreve met him at the human line with an expression that travelled through relief, confusion, anger, and reluctant respect in roughly 5 seconds. Soren held up a hand before he could speak. The corridor opens tomorrow morning, Soren said. Get the supply wagons ready tonight. He walked to the small tent at the rear assigned to Neve. She had refused to stay in Ashwick, which surprised no one who knew her. She was awake, sitting cross-legged in the tent entrance, with a blanket around her shoulders, and the particular look she got when she was trying very hard to appear calm. He sat beside her. He reached into his pocket. He put the handkerchief in her hands. She looked at it. You came back, she said. Yes. The people in the way station. Safe. Coming to neutral ground tomorrow. She looked at the handkerchief, at the uneven waves and the fraying thread. Then she looked at him, at whatever was on his face, and didn't ask any of the questions she was clearly holding. Was it bad? She said. He thought about standing in the desert between two armies, about stepping forward instead of back, about Zeth's wolf-yellow eyes across a fire, about Duvok's open hand, about saying yes, about Vara holding the handkerchief, carefully, with the care of someone who understood something without being told what it was. No, he said, which was not quite accurate, which was also not quite a lie. Neve leaned her head against his shoulder. The blanket was thin, and she was still too cold, and in 2 days there would be supply wagons, and none of the problems would be solved, but the shape of a solution would be there, which is the most you can ask for. He put his arm around her shoulders. They sat until the stars came out, more than you can ever see from inside a city, more than enough. Some things don't resolve. Some distances don't close. 2 armies were still in a desert. 2 worlds were still divided by sand and history and centuries of deciding that different meant dangerous. But somewhere between those worlds, a conversation had happened. An old orc with 3 fingers had held out his hand. A man with a pocket handkerchief had said yes. You build a bridge, 1 stone at a time. You don't get to see it finished, but you get to put down the first stone. The drums in the orc camp carried across the desert on the night wind. Steady, measured, not war drums, something quieter. The rhythm of people who have survived another day and intend to survive the next. Soren listened until his sister fell asleep. He kept listening after that. And that's where we leave Soren, Vara, Zeth, and maybe where we leave all of us, really, standing at some border between what we fear and what we need, deciding whether the bravest move is to push through alone or to say yes when a hand is offered. If this story moves something in you, if you found yourself thinking about courage, about pride, about the things we carry in our pockets and what they mean, then subscribe to Orcbound Tales. There are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about impossible meetings, about the weight of honor, about the things that happen when 2 worlds stop fighting long enough to look at each other. Leave a comment below. What would you have done? Would you have sent the detachment or gone alone? We'll see you in the next story.